three receptionists stood in the glass lobby of Chicago's most powerful corporation and laughed at an old woman in worn clothing openly in front of dozens of employees who recorded everything on their phones. They called her a beggar and ordered security to remove her from the premises. Everyone watched. Nobody moved. Then Ryan Carter, a broke delivery driver still drowning in medical debt from his late wife's final months, stepped forward and put himself between the woman and the guards. He was threatened with losing his contract on the spot. Before she left, the old woman pressed a folded slip of paper into his hand. 5 words. "Come back and find me." Who was she? Ryan Carter's day started the way most of his days did, with a cold apartment, a cup of instant coffee, and a delivery app already loaded with 6 stops before 8 in the morning. He drove a beat-up cargo van that made a grinding sound whenever he hit a speed bump, which in Chicago meant roughly every 2 blocks. The heater worked on one side. He kept a folded jacket on the passenger seat and used it as a lap blanket when the temperature dropped below freezing. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was a structured one, and structure was the only thing keeping him upright since Margaret died 2 years ago. He didn't talk about her much, not because he had moved on, but because he hadn't, and he knew the difference. The hospital bills had taken everything: the savings account, the emergency fund, the small amount they had set aside for a future that never arrived. What remained was a monthly debt payment that ate roughly a third of his income, a 1-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park with a leaky bathroom faucet, and a reputation among the local dispatch network as the guy who always showed up and never complained. That reputation was the closest thing he had to job security. The Hartwell Global delivery was logged as a standard commercial drop, 4 sealed boxes, business documents, scheduled for the main lobby at 9:45. Ryan had driven past the building plenty of times, but had never made a delivery inside. It was one of those towers that felt designed to make you aware of your own smallness, all dark glass and polished steel, the kind of building where the lobby alone cost more to maintain per year than his entire neighborhood block. He pulled into the loading zone, stacked the boxes on his hand truck, and pushed through the revolving door. The lobby was wide and cold and very quiet, the way expensive spaces often are. Marble floors, low lighting a reception desk that stretched the length of a school bus. 3 women sat behind it, all of them in their late 20s, all of them in matching dark blazers, all of them looking at something near the far end of the lobby, with expressions that sat somewhere between amusement and contempt. Ryan followed their line of sight and saw the old woman standing near the entrance, holding a small canvas bag against her chest. She was maybe 75, possibly older. Her coat was a faded green wool that had clearly been good quality once decades ago. Her shoes were sensible and worn at the heels. Her white hair was pinned back neatly, and she stood very straight, which gave her a dignity that seemed to irritate the women behind the desk more than her presence itself. She wasn't disheveled. She wasn't making noise. She was simply standing there, and she looked like she was waiting for someone. One of the receptionists, a tall woman with a sleek ponytail, raised her voice across the lobby without bothering to stand. She told the old woman that this was a private building and that she needed to leave. The old woman said something too quietly for Ryan to hear from where he stood. The receptionist with the ponytail said it again, louder this time, and the word she chose was "ma'am." But the way she said it meant something else entirely. 2 other employees near the elevator bank had their phones out. Neither of them was making a call. Ryan set down the hand truck near the reception desk and stayed where he was for a moment. There was still a rational version of this, where it wasn't his business. He had a delivery to log a signature to get in 5 more stops after this. He had a debt payment due in 11 days. He was aware of all of that. He watched a security guard begin walking toward the old woman from the far side of the lobby, and something in the deliberate slowness of the guard's stride, the performance of it, the pleasure in it, made Ryan's decision for him before he had consciously made it. He walked over. He placed himself between the guard and the old woman, not aggressively but squarely. He told the guard he could hold on a minute, The guard told him to step aside and mind his own business. Ryan said he was minding it just fine, and asked what exactly the woman had done to require removal from a building lobby. The receptionist with the ponytail called out from behind the desk that this wasn't his concern, and that if he didn't back off, they would report him to his dispatch company. Ryan turned and looked at her directly. He told her to go ahead. There were more phones out now, maybe 8 or 9. Nobody stepped forward to say anything. The lobby was very still in the way that spaces get when everyone present has collectively decided to watch rather than act, and Ryan was aware of being watched in a way that made his skin feel tight, but he didn't move. The old woman was standing just behind his left shoulder. He could hear her breathing, steady, not panicked, the breathing of someone who had been in worse situations and knew how to wait them out. The guard backed off, not because he was convinced, but because the phones were still recording and the math had shifted. One of the other receptionists made a point of writing something down, making sure Ryan saw her doing it. A man in a suit who had emerged from a hallway near the elevators took one look at the situation, turned around, and went back the way he came. Ryan watched him go and filed that away. He turned to the old woman. He asked her if she was all right. She said she was fine, and thanked him in a voice that was low and precise, and carried no performance of gratitude, just the plain thing itself. She told him she had come to see someone in the building, and that she had not been permitted past the lobby. Ryan asked if she wanted him to call someone for her. She looked at him for a moment, in a way that felt like she was measuring something, and then she said, "No, that it was all right, and that she would find another way." They walked out together. Ryan held the door. Outside on the sidewalk, the wind off Lake Michigan hit them both, and the old woman adjusted her coat collar with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been dealing with Chicago winters her entire life. Ryan asked her if she had somewhere to go, and if she needed a ride anywhere. She said she had a car waiting around the corner. She reached into her canvas bag and produced a small, folded piece of paper and pressed it into his hand, without drawing attention to the gesture. She told him to come back and find her. Then she walked away around the corner of the building, and he watched her go until she was out of sight. He stood on the sidewalk with the paper in his hand for a moment, before he remembered that he had not completed his delivery. He went back inside. The lobby had returned to its normal temperature of performative efficiency, phones put away, receptionists looking at their screens, the guard posted back at his station near the wall. Nobody acknowledged Ryan when he walked back to his hand truck. The woman with the ponytail processed his delivery signature without making eye contact, and handed his clipboard back without a word. His phone rang while he was loading the empty hand truck back into the van. It was his dispatch coordinator, a man named Frank, who told him in a tone that was apologetic, but final, that the Hartwell Global account had filed a complaint about a delivery driver causing a disturbance in their lobby, and had requested that Ryan be removed from their route permanently. The contract was a recurring weekly account. It represented roughly $1,200 per month. Frank said he was sorry. Ryan said he understood and ended the call. He sat in the driver's seat for a while, with the engine idling and the heater blowing cold air on his right knee. He thought about the 11 days until his debt payment, and the $1,200 that was now gone, and the 5 remaining stops on his route that would collectively pay him about $60. He unfolded the paper the old woman had given him. The handwriting was small and neat and slightly formal, like someone who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was taught as a discipline. The 5 words were exactly what he had already heard her say: "Come back and find me." There was no name, no phone number, no explanation of what she meant by "here," or how exactly he was supposed to find a woman he didn't know in a building where he had just been effectively banned. The rational reading of the situation was that he had made a significant financial sacrifice for a stranger he would never see again, that the note was the impulsive gesture of an elderly woman who had been frightened and was now safe, and that the most sensible course of action was to start calling other dispatch companies to replace the lost income. He folded the paper back up and put it in his jacket pocket. He spent that evening calling 3 dispatch companies and getting 2 callbacks. He filed the paperwork to pick up additional weekend routes. He went to bed, having done everything reasonable. But the image that sat behind his eyes when he tried to sleep wasn't the lobby, or the phones, or the receptionists, or even the lost contract. It was the way the old woman had looked at him on the sidewalk. Not with relief, not with fear, but with that measuring expression, as if she had been trying to determine whether he was the kind of person she could afford to trust. And the way she had pressed the note into his hand, with no explanation, no name, no number. Not like someone who was confused or frightened, like someone who had already thought it through. He got up at 6 the next morning and drove back to the Hartwell Global building. He didn't go inside. He parked across the street and watched the entrance for an hour, which told him nothing except that the building processed a significant volume of suited professionals between 7 and 8 in the morning, and that the same security guard from the day before arrived for his shift at 7:15. Ryan bought a coffee from a cart vendor on the corner and sat with it and thought about what he actually knew. He knew the old woman had come to see someone inside the building and had not been allowed past the lobby. He knew the staff had treated her with a specific kind of contempt, not the impatient dismissal you might give a confused tourist, but something more deliberate, more practiced. He knew that the man in the suit who had come out of the hallway near the elevators had seen the situation and immediately retreated without intervening. That detail bothered him more than the receptionists did. The receptionists were performing for each other for the phones, for whatever social economy existed behind that desk. The man in the suit had made a private calculation and walked away. That was a different thing. Ryan pulled out the folded note and looked at it again. "Come back and find me." He took out his phone and searched the name Hartwell Global. The company had been founded 31 years ago and had grown into one of the largest private holding companies in the country, with interests in real estate logistics and financial services. The current CEO was listed as Claire Hartwell. There was a profile photo, a woman in her mid-50s, dark hair, sharp features, photographed at what appeared to be a charity event. Ryan stared at the photo for a long time. Then he looked back at the building across the street. He didn't know yet what the connection was, but the old woman's last name was Hartwell. He was certain of it without being able to say exactly why. Something in the way she had stood in that lobby, straight-backed and patient, as if she had every right to be there and knew it, even as everyone around her acted like she didn't. He didn't have proof of anything. He had a folded piece of paper, a lost contract, a cold cup of coffee, and a feeling in his chest that he had learned to take seriously over 38 years of being wrong about a lot of things, but rarely wrong about people. He finished the coffee and started the van. He had 4 stops to make before noon. But he was going to come back, and when he did, he was going to find out who Eleanor Hartwell actually was, because he was now nearly certain that the old woman standing in the lobby of Hartwell Global being photographed and mocked and removed by people who worked in her name, without knowing it was not a stranger wandering in from the street. She was something else entirely, and the people inside that building who had treated her like nothing were going to have to account for that eventually. Ryan didn't know yet how or when or what his role in it would be, but he folded the note carefully and put it back in his pocket, and he drove. The first thing Ryan did was try the obvious route. He went back to the Hartwell Global building 3 days after the incident, walked up to the reception desk, a different set of faces this time, though the desk itself felt identical, and asked to speak with someone in administration about a personal matter involving a woman named Eleanor Hartwell. The receptionist, a young man with a carefully neutral expression, typed something into his computer and told Ryan there was no record of anyone by that name associated with the company. Ryan asked him to check again. The man said he had, and suggested Ryan contact the general inquiry line if he had further questions. Ryan took the business card that was slid across the desk, walked back out to the sidewalk, and stood in the cold for a moment, understanding that the wall he had just hit was not accidental. He called the general inquiry line from his van. It rang 4 times and transferred him to a voicemail box. He left a message with his name and callback number and a brief, carefully worded explanation that he was trying to locate an elderly woman who had visited the building the previous week. Nobody called back. He started searching differently after that. He spent evenings on his laptop, going through public records, old news archives, corporate filings. Hartwell Global had been founded 31 years ago by a man named Douglas Hartwell, who had died of a heart attack 16 years back. His daughter Claire Hartwell had taken over as CEO within the following year and had grown the company significantly since then. There were interviews with Claire in business publications, photographs from industry events, a profile piece in a financial magazine from about 4 years ago. In none of them did she mention a mother. In none of them was any maternal figure referenced at all. Ryan found Douglas Hartwell's obituary and read it carefully. It named Claire as a surviving family member. It did not name a spouse. That absence bothered him. Obituaries named spouses. It was one of the few things they reliably did. The omission was either an editorial choice or something else, and Ryan had spent enough time around deliberate omissions in his life to recognize the shape of one. He found a former Hartwell Global employee through a logistics industry forum, a man named Dennis, who had worked in the company's operations division about 12 years ago and had since moved to a smaller firm in Indianapolis. Ryan sent him a direct message through the forum, keeping it simple, saying he was doing some background research on the company's early history and asking if Dennis would be willing to talk. Dennis wrote back 2 days later with a phone number and a time. The call lasted 22 minutes. Dennis was cautious in the way people are when they've signed non-disclosure agreements and aren't entirely sure what they can say, but careful enough to be useful. He confirmed that there had been a woman connected to the Hartwell family. In the early days of the company, someone he had seen once or twice at the offices, back when the building had a different address, and the company was a fraction of its current size. He didn't know her name. He described her as an older woman, well-dressed, who seemed familiar with the space, in a way that suggested ownership rather than visitation. He said that at some point, he placed it roughly 9 or 10 years ago, she stopped appearing. He didn't know why. When Ryan asked if he had ever heard anyone discuss her absence, Dennis said there had been a general understanding among staff that certain topics were not raised and that this was one of them. Ryan thanked him and ended the call. He sat with that for a day. 9 or 10 years. Whatever had happened to Eleanor Hartwell's connection to this company, it had been severed deliberately and far enough back that most current employees would have no memory of her at all. That explained the receptionist's blank response. It didn't explain who had arranged the severance or why. The answer to that came from a direction Ryan hadn't anticipated. He had been running a reduced delivery route all week, picking up whatever overflow work he could get from 2 different dispatch companies to cover the income gap from the lost Hartwell account. One of those routes took him through the River North neighborhood, and on a Thursday afternoon, he pulled up to a restaurant supply company to drop off a package and found himself waiting in a back corridor while the receiving clerk finished a phone call. On the wall behind the clerk's desk was a framed magazine page, the kind of thing businesses sometimes displayed when they'd been featured in the press. It was a business journal piece from about 5 years ago, and across the top was a headline about Hartwell Global's expansion strategy. There was a group photograph. Ryan looked at it without particular intention at first, and then his eyes settled on a man standing to Claire Hartwell's left, broad-shouldered, well-dressed mid-50s, with an expression that read as practiced confidence rather than genuine ease. The caption identified him as Gavin Reed, Chief Operating Officer. Ryan photographed the magazine page with his phone and looked up Gavin Reed that evening. What he found was the profile of a man who had been with Hartwell Global for 14 years, who had arrived from a private equity background, and had steadily accumulated authority within the company over the following decade. He appeared at industry events. He gave occasional quotes to financial press. He sat on 2 external advisory boards. His public profile was clean and unremarkable, the kind of presence that was carefully maintained to be visible enough to establish credibility and controlled enough to give nothing away. What Ryan noticed was the timeline. Gavin Reed had joined Hartwell Global approximately 13 years ago. Eleanor had stopped appearing at the company approximately 9 or 10 years ago, according to Dennis. The overlap was not proof of anything, but it was the kind of coincidence that Ryan had learned not to dismiss. He started paying closer attention to Gavin Reed's public record board meeting, minutes that were publicly filed statements, attributed to him in press releases, the structure of announcements that came from Hartwell Global over the years. He was looking for something he couldn't fully articulate, yet a pattern, rather than a fact. He found it gradually in the way that patterns reveal themselves, not all at once, but through accumulation. Gavin Reed's name appeared with increasing frequency in company communications from roughly 10 years ago onward. His authority over operational and administrative decisions seemed to expand during the same period that Claire Hartwell's public appearances became more focused exclusively on external strategy and revenue. The internal architecture of the company, as best Ryan could read it from public documents, had quietly shifted in a way that placed Gavin Reed between the CEO and nearly everything else. Ryan was trying to figure out his next move when the problem found him instead. He was parked outside a grocery distribution center on a Wednesday morning, logging his delivery confirmation, when a black SUV pulled up alongside his van and sat there with the engine running. Ryan looked at it in his side mirror. The windows were tinted dark. It sat there for nearly 4 minutes without moving, and then pulled away when a delivery truck came in behind it and needed the space. Ryan noted the license plate and wrote it down on the back of a receipt from his glove compartment. 2 days later, a different vehicle, same color, same model, different plate, was parked across the street from his apartment building when he came home at 7 in the evening. It was gone when he looked out the window an hour later. Ryan was not the kind of person who believed in coincidences he could count. 2 in a week was not coincidence. Someone had identified him, and that meant someone had been paying attention since the lobby incident, or had started paying attention since he began asking questions. He heard from Frank at Dispatch again that same week. Another client account had filed a complaint about him, not Hartwell Global this time, but a commercial property management firm that Ryan had never had any issue with in 2 years of regular deliveries. The complaint alleged unprofessional conduct during a delivery, which was specific enough to be credible and vague enough to be impossible to disprove. Frank said he had to pull Ryan from that route pending review. That was another $400 per month gone. Ryan kept working and kept digging, but he was careful now in a way he hadn't needed to be before. He varied his routes home. He moved his research to a public library computer when he was looking into anything connected to Hartwell or Gavin Reed, on the logic that whatever they were watching, they probably weren't monitoring library terminals. He reached out to 2 more former Hartwell Global employees through professional networks, using a neutral framing about industry research. One never responded. The other replied briefly, and then stopped answering after Ryan's second message, which suggested she had either lost interest or been told to stop. It was at the library on a Tuesday afternoon that Ryan found the document that changed everything he thought he understood about Eleanor Hartwell's situation. It was buried in a supplemental filing attached to a corporate restructuring notice from 11 years ago, the kind of document that existed in public records precisely because it was supposed to be transparent, and that almost nobody ever read because it was buried in legal language and cross-referenced through 6 other filings. Ryan had been going through Hartwell Global's historical corporate records, systematically filing by filing, because he didn't know what he was looking for, and that meant he had to look at everything. The filing referenced a trust instrument originally established by Douglas Hartwell that named both his daughter Claire and his wife Eleanor as beneficiaries of a family governance structure tied to the founding of the company, Eleanor Hartwell. There it was in a footnote in a restructuring document, attached to a clause that had been amended. The amendment dated to a period that fell precisely within the window when Gavin Reed had been consolidating his internal authority. The amendment removed Eleanor Hartwell's name from the governance trust and replaced it with a reference to a third-party administrative entity. The entity's registration led back through 2 layers of corporate structure to a holding company that Ryan spent the better part of an evening trying to trace before he hit a wall of private registration. He sat back in the library chair and looked at what he had. Eleanor Hartwell was not a confused elderly woman who had wandered into the wrong building. She was the widow of the man who had founded Hartwell Global. She had a legal stake in the company's foundational governance documents that had been quietly excised through a series of amendments at a time when the man now serving as COO had been steadily acquiring internal control. And for the past 9 or 10 years, she had apparently been systematically cut off from any meaningful access to the company or to her own daughter. Ryan thought about Claire Hartwell's profile piece, the interviews where no mother was mentioned. He thought about Eleanor standing in that lobby, straight-backed and patient, holding her canvas bag. He thought about the deliberate contempt in the receptionist's voice, the practiced quality of it, the way it didn't seem to surprise Eleanor at all, as if this had happened before. He thought about the man in the suit who had seen it from across the lobby and turned around and walked away without a second look. He printed the relevant pages and folded them into his jacket. He drove home, taking a different route than usual, and spent that evening organizing everything he had found. The dentist called the timeline, the corporate filings, the 2 SUV sightings, the complaint to dispatch into a single coherent document on his laptop. It wasn't proof of everything. It was proof of enough. Enough to take to someone who could do something with it, or enough to take directly to Claire Hartwell, if he could figure out how to reach her without going through the wall of people who worked for Gavin Reed. He was still working out how to do that when his situation got considerably worse. A certified letter from his landlord arrived the following morning, notifying him that his rent payment for the previous month had not cleared, which Ryan knew because the dispatch income losses had left him short, and that he now had 10 days to pay the balance, plus a late fee before formal proceedings would begin. 2 days after that, the second dispatch company he had picked up work from called to tell him that due to an insurance compliance issue on his vehicle registration, they were temporarily suspending his work authorization pending review. Ryan checked his registration. It was current. He had renewed it 2 months ago. He had the paperwork. Someone had filed a false compliance report, and the company had acted on it before verifying. He had no income now. He had partial evidence of a large-scale conspiracy to isolate and disenfranchise an elderly woman from her own family and the company her late husband had built. He had a landlord counting down 10 days. He had 2 SUVs he had stopped counting because the number had gotten too high. A colleague he had once helped out on a busy week told him over the phone to drop whatever he was looking into before he lost more than just work. The colleague said he didn't know the details, but that he'd heard Ryan's name come up somewhere it shouldn't have, and that was enough for him to make the call. Ryan thanked him. He sat at his kitchen table with the printed documents and his laptop, and a silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. He had the shape of the truth. He didn't have Eleanor. He had lost track of her the moment she walked around the corner of the Hartwell building on the day of the lobby incident, and he had no phone number, no address, no way to reach her. The note she had given him said to come back and find her. He had come back. What he had found instead was the outline of everything that had been done to her, and a growing list of things being done to him to make sure he stopped. He looked at the folded note on the table beside the laptop. He had kept it in his jacket pocket for weeks and had moved it to the table when he started worrying about losing it. 5 words. Come back and find me. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at the corporate filing with Eleanor's name in it, and then he closed the laptop and decided that whatever came next, he was not going to be the person who walked away. The call came at 11:47 at night from a number Ryan didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He had been sitting at his kitchen table for 2 hours, going through the same documents he had already read a dozen times, and he was tired in the specific way that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from the sustained effort of holding a difficult situation together through willpower alone. He picked up on the fourth ring. The voice on the other end was a woman's. She spoke quietly and without introduction, the way people do when they're calling from somewhere they don't want to be overheard. She said she knew who Ryan was, and that she knew what he had been looking into, and that Eleanor Hartwell was being held at a private residential facility on the northwest side of the city. Not a hospital, not a care home in any conventional sense, but a private property that Gavin Reed's administrative entity leased under a wellness services registration. She gave Ryan an address. She said Eleanor had been brought there approximately 3 weeks ago, shortly after her appearance at the Hartwell Global lobby, and that the people managing the facility had been told she was a family member experiencing a mental health crisis requiring supervised rest. She said that was not true. She said Ryan needed to move quickly because there was a board meeting at Hartwell Global in 36 hours, and after that meeting, certain decisions would be finalized that would make Eleanor's situation very difficult to reverse. Ryan asked who she was. The woman said it didn't matter and ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, and then wrote the address down on the same notepad where he had been tracking everything else. He looked at it. He thought about the false insurance complaint, and the SUVs and the dispatch accounts, and the landlord's letter. He thought about what it meant that someone on the inside had risked making this call. He thought about the 36 hours. Then he got up, put on his jacket, and picked up the folder of printed documents he had been building for weeks. He drove to the address at just past midnight. It was a large residential property on a quiet street set back from the road, behind a low fence, with 2 vehicles parked in the front and lights on in 2 of the ground floor windows. It looked like exactly what it was registered as, a private wellness facility, anonymous and unremarkable. Ryan parked half a block down and sat looking at it. He could see a figure moving past one of the lit windows. He couldn't tell who it was. He noted the vehicles, noted the layout as best he could from the street, and drove home. He spent the rest of the night working out the only approach that made any sense. Going to the facility directly and demanding Eleanor's release would accomplish nothing. He had no legal standing, and whatever documentation Gavin's people had filed to place her there would be sufficient to turn him away, and probably result in another call to someone who would make his life worse. Going to the police was also not straightforward. He had documents suggesting financial manipulation and corporate fraud, not a kidnapping in any form that law enforcement would act on overnight. What he had was evidence, and the only place that evidence would matter in the next 36 hours was in front of the people who had the authority to act on it. The Hartwell Global Board meeting was the answer. It was the one place where Claire Hartwell would be present and where the company's governance structure would be formally assembled. If Ryan could get Eleanor into that room before the meeting concluded, the evidence he had gathered would land in front of the only audience that could immediately act on it. The problem was access. Ryan had been banned from the building. He had no appointment, no press credentials, no legal representation. What he had was a folder of documents, a van, and the address of the facility where Eleanor was being held. He arrived at the facility at 7 the following morning. He rang the front entrance intercom and told the staff member who answered that he was Eleanor Hartwell's nephew, that there had been a family emergency, and that he needed to speak with her immediately. There was a long wait. The staff member came back and said that Mrs. Hartwell was resting and was not receiving visitors. Ryan said that was not acceptable given the nature of the emergency and asked to speak with whoever was managing the property. Another wait. A man came on the intercom, not a medical professional Ryan could tell immediately, but someone trained to sound like one, and repeated that visits were not permitted without prior authorization from the designated family contact. Ryan asked for the name of the designated family contact. The man said that information was confidential. Ryan said he understood, stepped back from the intercom, and looked at the building. He had expected this. He had not come expecting them to let him in. He had come because he needed Eleanor to know he was there, and that the board meeting was in approximately 29 hours, and that she needed to be ready to leave when the moment came. He went around the side of the property on foot. The fence was low enough that he could see the side garden from the adjacent sidewalk. He could see a window on the ground floor with a light on. He stood at the fence and called out her name. He felt slightly ridiculous doing it, but he did it anyway. Twice, not loudly enough to draw significant attention, but loudly enough to carry. Nothing happened. He waited 3 minutes and tried again. The curtain in the lit window moved. He waited. A hand appeared at the edge of the curtain and held something up against the glass, a white piece of paper. He couldn't read what was written on it from where he stood. He held up his own folder of documents in response, so she could see he had something. The paper came down and the curtain closed. He went back to his van and wrote a brief note of his own, the date of the board meeting. The time, 2 words: "I'm coming." He folded it small and tucked it into an envelope along with 1 page from his document file, the corporate trust filing that showed Eleanor's name and what had been done to it. He went to the front intercom again and told the staff member that he was leaving a letter for Mrs. Hartwell that contained time-sensitive legal information, and that if the facility refused to deliver it, they would be obstructing a matter of active corporate governance documentation. He used the phrasing deliberately. He didn't know if it meant anything legally. He suspected the staff member didn't know either. The door opened slightly, and a hand reached out and Ryan placed the envelope in it. He drove away and spent the rest of the day working through the second problem, how to get himself and Eleanor into the Hartwell Global Board meeting. He had considered every option he could think of, and had landed on the only one that had any chance of working. He called a woman named Sandra, who he had met twice through a community legal aid organization, where Margaret had volunteered in the years before she got sick. Sandra was a paralegal, not a lawyer, but she knew the building. She had done document delivery there twice in the past year, for a firm that occasionally worked with Hartwell Global on contract matters. Ryan explained the situation to her over the phone as concisely and factually as he could, and told her what he needed. Sandra was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said she would meet him at 7 the following morning. He barely slept. He packed the complete document folder, every page he had printed, organized in the order he intended to present it, and set it by the door. He set his phone alarm for 5:45 and lay on top of the covers and watched the ceiling for what felt like most of the night. He thought about Eleanor in that facility, and whether she had received the note, and whether she understood what he was attempting. He thought about Gavin Reed, who by now almost certainly knew that Ryan had not stopped digging and had not been sufficiently discouraged by the loss of income or the surveillance or the compliance complaint. He thought about Claire Hartwell, who was going to walk into a board meeting in the morning expecting a routine session, and was instead going to have her entire understanding of the last 9 or 10 years of her life dismantled in front of the company's senior leadership. He didn't let himself think too much about whether his plan would work, because it was the only plan he had, and doubt at this stage would cost him more than it could possibly give him. He was at the facility at 6:15 the next morning before the city had fully woken up. He rang the intercom once. There was a longer wait than the day before, and then the sound of the door's electronic lock disengaging. The door opened from the inside. A staff member in the corridor beyond looked at Ryan with an expression that was carefully blank. Not hostile, not cooperative. The expression of someone who had received an instruction they didn't fully understand and had decided the safest course was to follow it without comment. Eleanor was standing in the hallway behind her, already dressed, already wearing the green wool coat, already holding her canvas bag. She had been ready before Ryan arrived. She walked to Ryan's van with the same straight-backed steadiness she had shown in the lobby weeks ago. And when she got in, she looked at him with the measuring expression he remembered from the first day, and said that she had been waiting for him to come back since the morning she handed him the note. Ryan said he had taken longer than he'd intended. She said he was on time. He pulled away from the curb. Sandra met them in a parking structure 2 blocks from Hartwell Global at 7:15. She had a building access badge from her previous deliveries and a paralegal's credentials that would get her through the lobby without question, and she had thought through the logistics carefully enough that Ryan trusted her read on it. The 3 of them went over the plan once standing between parked cars in the concrete cold of the structure. Eleanor listened without interrupting and asked 2 precise questions at the end, both of them about the documents, about which filings Ryan had, and whether the trust amendment was among them. Ryan showed her the folder. She looked through it quickly with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for, and when she found the trust filing, she held it for a moment without expression, and then placed it carefully back in the folder and handed it to Ryan. They entered the building at 7:50. Sandra led. She presented her credentials at the reception desk and explained she was there to deliver documents for the board meeting to a specific administrative contact, a name she had researched the night before. The receptionist called up to confirm. There was a wait of roughly 90 seconds that felt considerably longer. The confirmation came through. Sandra went through the turnstile. Ryan and Eleanor walked through behind her, close enough that the moment of their passage registered as a single event, rather than 3 separate ones. The security guard near the elevator bank looked up and then looked back at his station. The board meeting was on the 32nd floor. The elevator ride took 22 seconds. Ryan counted. The doors of the boardroom were glass, and through them, Ryan could see the table already occupied, 12 or 14 people suits. The particular stillness of a meeting that had recently been called to order. Claire Hartwell sat at the head of the table. Gavin Reed sat 3 seats to her left, and he was speaking when the boardroom doors opened. He stopped speaking when he saw Eleanor. The room took a moment to process what it was looking at: an elderly woman in a worn green coat, standing in the doorway of a 32nd floor boardroom that was not open to unscheduled visitors, accompanied by a man in a delivery driver's jacket, holding a folder of documents. Claire Hartwell's expression moved through several things very quickly: confusion, recognition of the man she didn't know, and then something else entirely, when her eyes reached the woman beside him. She stood up from her chair. She said one word. She said it quietly, almost to herself, as a person says a word, when what they're seeing contradicts something they've believed for a very long time. She said, "Mom." Ryan set the folder on the table. He had organized it to be self-explanatory: the trust filing on top, then the corporate amendments, then the timeline he had constructed from public records, and the Dennis call, and everything else he had accumulated over the past several weeks. He told the room as directly and briefly as he could what the documents showed: that Eleanor Hartwell was the widow of the company's founder, that her governance rights had been removed through a series of internal amendments during a period when Gavin Reed was consolidating administrative control, that she had been systematically isolated from her daughter and from the company, and that she had most recently been held at a private facility under a false mental health designation, arranged through an entity that traced back to Reed's administrative structure. He said all of this in less than 3 minutes, and then he stopped talking. Gavin Reed started to say something. One of the other board members, an older man at the far end of the table, held up his hand, and Reed stopped. The older man reached for the folder and began reading. The room was very quiet. Claire Hartwell had come around the table and was standing beside Eleanor, and Eleanor had taken her daughter's hand in both of hers, and neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The years of distance and manipulation that had existed between them were still there, would need time and conversation, and all the difficult work that estrangement requires, but the lie that had sustained that distance was now sitting on a boardroom table in a folder of printed documents, and everyone in the room could see it. Gavin Reed was asked to leave the room. He left. The board voted within the hour to place him on immediate administrative suspension, pending a formal investigation. 2 board members, who had been appointed during the period of Reed's consolidation, recused themselves from the vote, which Ryan took as its own form of confirmation. Ryan sat in a chair along the wall while the board worked through its initial response. Sandra had gone back downstairs after the documents had been presented. Eleanor sat at the table next to Claire. At one point, Claire looked across the room at Ryan with an expression that he didn't quite know how to categorize. It was not simply gratitude. It was something more complicated than that. The look of a person who has just been shown a gap in their own understanding that they didn't know existed and is still absorbing the size of it. Ryan nodded once and looked down at his hands. He was aware that he was wearing the same jacket he wore every day for deliveries, that he had not slept properly in 2 nights, and that the folder he had carried into this room had cost him most of his monthly income. His main dispatch contracts, and a significant amount of the certainty he'd once had that situations this large would always outrun someone in his position. He was aware of all of that, and he was also aware that none of it felt like a loss. He stepped out into the hallway when the formal proceedings began in earnest, because what happened next was not his to participate in. It belonged to Eleanor and Claire and the structure of accountability that the documents he had found made possible. His part was done. He leaned against the wall in the corridor on the 32nd floor and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, gray and sharp and cold and very wide, and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in weeks. The next morning, Ryan was in his apartment doing nothing in particular, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of instant coffee, the same way every day started when he heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling up outside. He went to the window and looked down. There were 4 black cars on the street below, the kind that came with drivers, the kind that cost more per hour than Ryan made in a day. He watched them for a moment without understanding, and then his front door buzzer sounded. Claire Hartwell was standing in the hallway outside his apartment when he opened the door. She was alone, which surprised him. She was dressed simply relative to what he would have expected, a dark coat, no visible markers of the life she occupied. She looked like she had not slept much either. She told him she wanted to speak with him, and Ryan stepped aside and let her in. She stood in the middle of his small living room and looked at the kitchen table, where the documents had been at the notepad, with the address still written on it, at the folded piece of paper, Eleanor's note that was still sitting where Ryan had left it the night before. She picked it up with his permission and read the 5 words. She set it back down. She told him that the board had spent most of the previous night in emergency session, that Gavin Reed's suspension had been formalized, and that the investigation would be comprehensive. That her lawyers were already working to restore the legal standing that had been removed from the governance trust. She told him that her mother had explained late the previous evening the full sequence of what had happened, not just what Ryan's documents showed, but the years before the gradual isolation, the way small manipulations had accumulated over a decade into something that had separated 2 people who had never intended to lose each other. Then she told him that she wanted to offer him a position. Not charity, she was specific about that. A role in Hartwell Global's logistics and operations division, working on the kind of ground-level distribution problems that someone with his experience would understand better than any consultant she could hire. The salary she named was more than Ryan had made in the previous 3 years combined. She said he could take time to think about it. He said he didn't need time. She thanked him before she left, not in the way that people thank service workers, not in the way that the wealthy thank the useful. She thanked him the way you thank someone who did something that mattered when they had every reason not to. Ryan accepted it without deflecting and without making it smaller than it was, because it wasn't small, and he knew that too. After she left, he stood at the window and watched the 4 black cars pull away from the curb. The street returned to its ordinary self, a Chicago morning in winter, cold and gray, and indifferent to individual outcomes. He finished his coffee. He thought about Margaret the way he still did every morning, and he thought about the note on the table, and he thought about the lobby and the phones, and the guard's deliberate stride, and the moment he had decided without quite deciding. He didn't feel heroic about any of it. He felt like himself a man who had seen something wrong and hadn't been able to look away from it, and who had followed that inability as far as it went. It had gone further than he expected. Most things did when you didn't stop. He rinsed his cup, put on his jacket, and started the day.